there are so many things we need to fix in the green transition. There are so many things we need to fix in the individual organization. But we have a finite amount of resources, time and attention span in the organization.
If sustainability starts out as a PR and marketing effort, then of course it will be heavily scrutinized. Whereas if it's part of your decision-making process internally, that you say we want to emit less CO2, we want to make more money, here's a business case that we assume is going to emit less CO2 and make more money, then that's okay, because it becomes a financial decision. It's not a publicity or advertisement.
If you arm yourself with these three questions, is it material? What is the business case? And who owns it? You will uncover a lot of the things that you need to know, and you'll be much more likely to succeed.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. My name is Frederik. I'm the CEO of Green Innovation Group, and I have Joachim in the studio today to help answer three great sustainability questions you can always ask yourself before you venture into a project. So first of all, is it important, and how do I know that it's important? Second, what is the business case? And third, who is going to own it? Own it being the project. So Joachim, welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much, Frederik.
Really happy to have you here for answering these questions. Why, when we list up these three questions, why is it you really like that approach of asking these things?
I really like these questions because when we're working with sustainability, it's still a quite immature area, both on an overall level compared to, for instance, finance, which we have worked with for hundreds of years, but also on an individual level for the person. So there's going to be a lot of things you don't know. And when you don't have answers, it's quite easy to get stuck and get paralyzed. And sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. So it's very good to be equipped with good questions there. Questions that make sure that even if there's a lot of things I don't know, I will more know what to look for, and I get primed to be steered in the right direction.
Yeah, and you can kind of build a hypothesis and sort of say, I'm assuming this and that. And you can sort of develop a feel of the game of running on assumptions, because it's impossible to know everything.
Yes.
And we're not here to know everything. We're here to make sustainability happen in practice.
Get shit done.
Get shit done. So let's dive into it. We brought the three questions. So the first one is it material, or is this important?
Yes. And that's an excellent question, because there are so many things we need to fix in the green transition. There are so many things we need to fix in the individual organization. But we have a finite amount of resources, time and attention span in the organization. So we made to make sure that whenever we are working with sustainability, we guide our efforts towards where they matter the most. And is it important or is it material is a great question to ask. So that is another way of saying that is that if we solve this, does it make a meaningful difference? And not all ideas, potential sustainability projects that come up makes a meaningful difference. A lot of sustainability initiatives that have been made don't actually make a meaningful difference. A classic example from the food industry that we can all understand is that if you take a carton of milk, there's been some improvements in the packaging so that it uses less CO2 in the packaging. And that's great, and you will get a high relative number. You can, as many dairy companies have advertised, 50% less CO2 in the packaging, that is. And that maybe translates, I don't know the specific numbers, but it's basically insignificant in the overall CO2 amount of the product, which stems from the milk.
Yeah. So it's not important.
It's not important.
That would be
it's
the
not
question
material.
here. Are we developing sustainable packaging for a product that is infinitely much more polluting than the packaging that's containing it?
Yeah.
Okay, improving on the packaging is actually not important.
Yeah. At least through the CO2 lens, So one way to get some nuance to is it material is that we can put different metrics or values on distance. So the obvious one would be, for instance, to say, is it material CO2 wise? That would be a classic first step, and it's a great one to always ask. But there might be things where we say it's not material CO2 wise, but it still does something, and it's very material for our revenue generation, or maybe even just for our awareness in the organization. Yeah. If it's very material for the awareness organization, it might be okay, but then you should do it knowing that this is not going to be material in our CO2 reductions, but we're doing this as an awareness initiative, program, case, you name it, to build the awareness around sustainability in our organization or with our partners or with our patients, whatever it might be.
An interesting case that comes to mind here is when we do ESG due diligences, we have a very long list of questions that we're asking, and we're helping in that due diligence process.
So just real quick, that's the checking if you're buying or selling an asset company, factory, or whatever. Green Innovation Group goes in and check, is it sound?
Helps figuring out if the house looks the way it's supposed to look from a sustainability perspective. But through the ESG or environment, social and governance lens, there's a whole range of questions that are relevant to ask if you're looking at a multinational asset that has offices and manufacturing plants all over the world, that are quite irrelevant if you're looking to purchase a small medtech company only based in Denmark with 50 employees in Denmark, for instance. Then the anti-corruption policy is probably not material for what they're doing. But it could be if we're looking at a multinational company that has sites all over the world and in countries with governments where corruption is a huge issue. Yeah. So this is sort of also to say there's a lot of problems in the world. A lot of them are quite severe, but they might not be as important in that business context.
Yes, and that could be for the overall company, can also be for the individual department, where you say, okay, but water is also important, but right now we are working with clinical trials, and what we really need to do is X, Y, Z. And then a natural follow-up question is that, okay, if it's a good question to ask what is material, what is important, then how do you know what is material and what is important? And that will highlight a lot of things about how well do you know your organization, how well do you know the resources that are being spent. If we take through the CO2 lens, it will quite fast highlight, okay, if I need to know what's material CO2-wise, I need to know where our CO2 emissions comes from. So either you have done a CO2 baselining exercise and you know, okay, this is what it's in my scope 1, 2, and 3. And if I break that down, then I know that in my scope 2, we are pretty good here on the renewable energy, but we're getting some steam that's being made with natural gas. So that's a big one. Okay. It also might come up that you say, okay, I don't know. I can't answer the question what's important and what's material because there's a data gap. But that's still a good result of asking that question.
Yeah.
Because now you know there's a data gap, and then you have turned an unknown into a known unknown.
Yeah, and that will be significant traction actually on that agenda, because you go from this sort of insecure feeling your way forwards into generating knowledge and data on which you can actually have sound decision making, and that's something that has been a bit missing, you could say, in sustainability efforts. We've seen countless examples of companies that have presented huge CO2 reductions on scope 1 and 2, and then no mention of the increase in scope 3 that might be 10 times the reduction in scope 1 and 2 combined.
Might be 80% or something like that. Another very good side effect of this question is that if done right, it will automatically steer your attention towards the core business or core service of your organization. Because you might have 5,000 different product categories, but if 80% of your revenue is coming from these 10 product categories, then naturally asking what is material will lead you towards those product categories, which if the revenue is coming from there, it will probably also have the highest volume of production and so on, and therefore use the largest amounts of CO2 and material. And so
maybe that can even inform strategic decision making later on, of maybe saying, okay, we're going to cut our losses on the product portfolio that is not generating the value for the business, and then we're also sort of cutting down on our emissions and our associated impact and so on and so forth. But maybe this is a great segue into the second question. What is the business case?
If I can just add one thing before we move on, a very good way to also make sure that you work on the important and material things is to establish threshold values. So just say that might be okay if this is below, if you're a large pharmaceutical, if this is below 50 million euro, we're not even going to look at it in our high level analysis. Or if it's below this amounts of tons of CO2, whatever. It might be isolated a really big problem, but it's simply not material. So threshold values can help.
Defining if a problem is big enough that you should actually start addressing it. Yeah, really good point. So the second question, what is the business case? Yeah. Why is this an important question to ask?
It's a super important question because even though most of the people who work in the healthcare sector do it very genuinely because they are passionate about helping people with illnesses, patients and so on, the common language of decision making is still the use of dollars, euros, and the business case.
It's what they say in the pharmaceutical industry, that cash rules everything around me.
Yeah, it's more true than you should know, and surprisingly enough, especially in the public sector. So this is something where you could think, okay, but this is only relevant for the listeners who are working in private companies or our private clients, but the healthcare systems and the public sectors are much more strapped for cash. So they need an even better reason, even better business case to go in and do something sustainable. So if you found out through the first question, okay, this is actually an important thing, then asking what is the business case is essentially going to tie sustainability into the core priorities of the organization. So how do we increase revenue from this? How do we make profit or reduce cost from this? How do we provide better care, better treatment, or more robust supply chain? Whatever it might be. I also think that's important to say that ideally I would say you strive for cost savings or increased revenue, but there might be some intermediaries in between that where you say, okay, well, in order for our product to leave the factory, we need to use a lot of water. We cannot be sure that we get this water in the future because the world is heating. So we are going to collect rainwater. And that might not give a specific dollar business case, but it does increase our delivery security in the future. That can be a fine case to start. But I think also this has a strategic potential as well, that sustainability efforts and sustainability departments are often cast as an add-on. So they're being portrayed as something outside the core business, outside. And the reality is that there are so many good sustainability business cases out there. We can reduce medical waste in the hospitals. We can make energy efficiency projects in production. We can get a faster time to market in R&D and clinical resource through sustainability efforts. Yeah. And these business cases are just as real as others. But most of the time, sustainability is still being viewed as sort of a compliance lens. How do we live up to regulation? Which is also important, but the compliance people are usually quite good at that already.
And I think there's a really useful tool here that's sort of playing into the threshold point from the first question, where you're defining a range and saying if it's less than this amount of dollars or this amount of CO2, it's not important. Where here, if we're looking at what's the business case, and of course you cannot know how much money are you going to save by which time, how much CO2 are you going to save by which time, but you can make an estimate. Yeah. So you can say, we believe that we're going to save $1,000 to $1,200 per procedure during this amount of time by doing this and that. And then you have set a range.
And the thing is, that's the same thing that's being done when you go to the finance department for all kinds of cases. And you can usually play into the language that your organization and the finance department will probably have some more or less strict guidelines already that, okay, if the payback time is less than 2 years, then it's just a no-brainer, we go, or if it's larger CapEx investments, then it might be a bit longer time periods. And a lot of sustainability initiatives fit right into that. And that's the best sustainability initiatives, is the ones that are a no-brainer, even if they weren't sustainable, because they should just be mandatory. But sometimes the opposite actually happen, that we get like, oh, this is sustainability, and can we be sure? And sometimes it gets more scrutinized than a normal business case would, which is weird. Yeah.
So something that we have also noticed here is that if sustainability starts out as a PR and marketing effort, then of course it will be heavily scrutinized. Whereas if it's part of your decision-making process internally, that you say, we want to emit less CO2, we want to make more money, here's a business case that we assume is going to emit less CO2 and make more money, then that's okay, because it becomes a financial decision. It's not a publicity or advertisement message that needs to come out. Yeah. Because of course, if you go out and you're in the market, you're in a very heavily scrutinized industry, like the pharmaceutical sector, you cannot go out and say, our drug, our treatment is more sustainable than the competitors, because then, it begs a lot of questions about what alternatives did the patient have.
You have to be really sure, at least.
What is the care system? You need to be absolutely certain if you go out and make public claims. And quite often that becomes an inhibiting factor, actually, that's limiting the degree of rollout of great sustainability initiatives and business cases. So we've seen hundreds of amazing business cases that have just been put in a desktop drawer because for one reason or another, it didn't work out. And this public scrutiny is something that we as sustainability professionals also need to sort of practice, not making it a PR project, because it's supposed to be a business project.
Yeah, definitely. And also, as you say, sometimes there's definitely greenwashing out there, but the fear of greenwashing is actually inhibiting sound, good sustainability projects that would be perfectly fine. Another key thing here, I think, is that some listeners might sit and think or encounter when they're talking to other people in their organization that, but is it then only with a CO2 tax? And naturally, when we're reducing CO2, a CO2 tax or fee will make the business case easier to do. But there are so many business cases out there, good sound business cases, that have decent payback times and work without any CO2 fee. And that's despite the fact that we're talking about in Denmark that there might be a CO2 tax coming, or it's more of a fee, but we actually have a price of CO2 already. Most people forget that. We do have the quota system, and there is, it's too low a price, but there is a price already.
It exists.
And that is most of the time not even being factored in, because that's just being done for the whole corporate or the whole organization, so it doesn't really figure into the Excel spreadsheet model on an individual department.
It's not distributed all the way down.
So even that's missing. But even despite that fact, that there's a cost component that's not in there that would be beneficial, there's still so many good business cases out there of making better isolation, making better air conditioning systems, switching to LEDs, making more preventive care, electrifying fleets and supply chains.
Reducing the amount of packaging, the amount of space a unit takes up. There's a lot of things.
Yeah. So great question. What is the business case?
And of course, in that, what's the business case? Pay attention to what is your hypothesis for revenue, for profit, for treatment improvement. Moving on to the third and last question: who owns it?
Yes.
Why is this question a good question to ask?
It's a very good question to ask in any project, in any organization. But sustainability, as we've talked about in other episodes, it's understaffed and under-prioritized. So it will often be thrown in between some chairs, in between some positions, or on top of another position. And if there's not a clear owner, down to a single person, it's much more likely that the project won't come to fruition or the initiative won't come to fruition. And it's much harder to prioritize for the people who end up owning it. And then we have, like we talked about in another episode, then we have these passionate heroes who usually steps in and then go at 120% capacity because they just threw that 20% on top. Another interesting things of asking who owns this is that you will start to notice that a lot of sustainability initiatives are put in at quarter positions, 20% positions, 15, like we...
Camilla is hired into a department.
Yeah.
She's allocated 20% for sustainability and 80% on doing engineering optimization on something.
Yeah, that could be a classic example. And what it also highlights who owns it is that, as in any project, it's much more likely to come to fruition if we have thought about what's the organizational structure around this. How's it being measured? Who owns it? The person who owns it, who does that person report to? How should it be prioritized? What does it mean owning it? What kind of resources can I call for? What kind of budget do I have? But also, if I own it, if it's very specific that I own it, then I also get confronted to ask these questions back. Okay, so if I'm owning it, but then I also need the mandate to do it. Yeah, and I need the budget to do it.
And I need to understand what timeline do I need to deliver what on.
So it will spur a lot of other good questions that will make the sustainability impact much more likely to happen. And it forces organizations to actually assign ownership and not just expect it to happen.
And maybe even sort of building an internal incentive to build systems and processes around this, because if Camilla owns it and she's only allocated 20% of her time, she will probably need to know what kind of support can she expect from who, when and where, and what will be the desired end result from setting these initiatives in motion. Yeah. So everything sort of becomes ingrained in the business logic of let's try and optimize reducing our costs and increasing our revenue generation so we can get more profit and get more product and service in the market. And sort of if we can do all that whilst reducing CO2 emissions, then we're on the right track for sustainable healthcare.
The key message is that you're not going to have all the answers. The good news is that you don't need to have all the answers. But if you arm yourself with these 3 questions, is it material? What is the business case and who owns it? You will uncover a lot of the things that you need to know and you'll be much more likely to succeed.
Amazing. Thanks for coming, Joachim.
Thank you.
Hello, dear listener. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe. We release episodes every week. We would love to get your feedback if you wouldn't mind. We would also love to get your rating on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. Thanks a lot for listening in. This means the world to us. Have a great day. Cheers.